Famed mountain climber and guide Rob Hall once said that if you're stuck near the summit of Mount Everest, you might as well be on the moon. Little did he know that his words would one day come true. Hall was pinned down in a perilous storm. His client, Doug Hansen, and his guide, Andy Harris, had disappeared during their descent from the summit. It was May 10th, 1996, when Hall called with his two-way radio to update his base camp team. Their hearts hit the floor when he reported that he was still at the south summit. The storm was so bad that no help would be coming. Rob Hall was himself on the moon with no help in sight. They're the most talked about 36 hours in the history of Mount Everest, second perhaps only to the disappearance of George Mallory and Sandy Irvin on June 8th in 1924. A dozen books were written about it, and 3 became bestsellers. What happened during that deadly storm that took 8 lives on May 10th and 11th in 1996? It's been the center of a heated debate and a bottomless pit of endless speculation and controversy, revealing much about human behavior and risk management. And Scott Fischer, guiding on Everest for the first time, said that they had built a yellow brick road to the summit of Mount Everest. It looked like a slam dunk that Scott Fischer and Rob Hall would be leading all of their clients to the summit of Mount Everest. The future looked bright. But instead, soon people would be choosing between who lived and who died during this storm. Okay, I want to jump in here real quick with a trigger warning, but first I want to let you know that this is a 2-part series on the 1996 Everest disaster. When I recorded the first track, it was over an hour long, and to me that's way too much for one sit-down meal, so I broke it up into 2 parts. And the trigger warning of this is that at the end of this part 1, there is some information that I'm going to share that I know will trigger some people. There are individuals out there who have very strong opinions about who perhaps the heroes are or who perhaps the villains are. This isn't about that. This is just about stating plain facts from the words and the mouths of individuals who were there and saw what was happening. So back to the video. Let's break down some of the key moments of this 1996 disaster. To do it in its entirety would take hours and hours. That's not what today's video is. We're going to break down just a couple of the key elements of the story and highlight some of the controversies that still linger today. One of them being Anatoly Boukreev. Is he the hero that many make him out to be, or was he acting on his own by going without oxygen, becoming a bit of a renegade up there, not really focused on the safety of the clientele? We'll talk a little bit about that. There were also critical mistakes made by the lead guides, the owners of the companies, Scott Fischer of Mountain Madness and Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants. Rob himself had already guided 39 people successfully, 100% success rate, getting his clients to the summit of Mount Everest, and Hall and Fischer would themselves die during this storm. Don't hesitate to comment below. The discussion down there in the comment section is always extremely interesting. Scott Fischer, he was a pure mountaineer, strong, confident, charismatic. He'd succeeded in climbing K2 and Everest without oxygen, certainly a rising star in the world of mountaineering and now into the guiding realm throughout the world, Everest for the first time, and he was intent on giving Rob Hall, who was indeed a friend of his, the owner of Adventure Consultants, a run for his money. There is no doubt about it. They were rivals on this mountain, but acting collaboratively, working together to ensure both of them succeeded. Perhaps Rob Hall's early successes on Mount Everest led him to a false sense of security on the mountain, leading him to think that almost nothing could go wrong as long as he teamed up with another strong company. And when Fischer and Hall's teams arrived at base camp, and soon they would be launched into even greater worldwide notoriety because on Fischer's team, the Manhattan socialite Sandy Pittman was there. She had already climbed 6 of the 7 summits, Everest being her last. She was providing reports to NBC News via satellite, reaching millions of viewers from base camp and above. On Rob Hall's team was journalist and New York Times best-selling author Jon Krakauer, who was writing an article on the newly developing guiding industry on Mount Everest. He was writing for Outside magazine. Krakauer, before the expedition, while he had dreamed for years about himself climbing Mount Everest, was cynical about the guiding industry and was there to keep an eye on how things went, and I think a little bit reluctant at first to go, but ultimately when he got to base camp saw that things looked to be working pretty well and grew excited as the expedition moved into full gear. For the 6 weeks preceding the storm that rocked Mount Everest and the mountaineering world, it was mostly a physical challenge for the climbers who had paid in excess of $50,000 to be there. A lot of money in 1996 years, a lot of money today. But as Lou Kashishka wrote, and my apologies if I mangled his last name, I've done that many times, no disrespect intended, who wrote an amazing book on the expedition itself. He was a client on Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants team. He said that when the storm hit, the challenge went from one of being a challenge of physical strength to a challenge of inner strength. It was said by Neal Beidleman in an interview that Hall and Fischer, while friends, they were in a competition. Let's face it, neither of them were interested in being the first to turn around. Perhaps it was the paradox, a game of chicken, if you will, like I'm not going to turn around unless he turns around. And so as the storm began to build in intensity, well, we got ourselves into deep trouble, and then when it was time to turn around, it was too late. Now, I just want to jump in here real quickly. I already do have several videos about the 1996 disaster, breaking down the Scott Fischer story, the Sandy Pittman story, and the Anatoly Boukreev story, including a live discussion of this. And I'm going to take just a basic overview of it in this video. I'll provide the links to all of those videos in the description below if you want to break off and go watch those, or wait till the end of this video to go watch them. That would be great, but it certainly will help build the story, because it's almost impossible to tell the entire story of each individual without going off into a multi-hour exegesis of the storm over Everest. The key characters in the storm were Adventure Consultants led by Rob Hall, Mountain Madness led by Scott Fischer. There was a Taiwanese expedition led by climber Makalu Gao, South African expedition led by Ian Woodall, which was a controversial expedition because Woodall was refusing to cooperate with any of the other teams when it came to fix ropes, and even had a couple of people on the expedition essentially quit and storm out of the expedition. Their main sponsor pulled support from the expedition. He was not a well-liked man on the expedition. Now, the other team of note was the IMAX filming expedition led by David Viesturs. They were filming a documentary. It became the greatest selling IMAX film of all time, titled simply Everest. The team included none other than the American mountain climber Ed Viesturs, who would go on to climb all 14 of the 8,000-meter peaks. And he was the star of the film. He was also close friends with Rob Hall and Scott Fischer. Let's fast forward to May 8th. The IMAX team was at Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, and I'll put the altitude of the camp underneath the screen. And their intent was to be one day ahead of all the other teams to get a jump start on it. Because of course, as a filmmaker, you can understand if you're doing the film Everest back then in 1996, your last thing that you would want when you had the beautiful money shot that was looking out from the summit as the climbers approached the summit, you don't want to see a long line of teams moving their way up in the background. So the IMAX team had hoped to get in and then get out before the other teams got up into position for the summit. But the IMAX team made a very tough decision. The conditions were horrible up high. They had been following weather forecasts from a forecaster not on Mount Everest but another part of the world, and they did not like the conditions. They thought this is not the time for us to climb. They made a tough decision, but based on the fact that they had plenty of food and reserves down at Camp 2 in the Western Cwm, they would head back down, wait for the other summit teams to make their rotations before they themselves went back up. On the way down from Camp 3, Ed Viesturs talks about running into Rob Hall and Scott Fischer's teams as they were heading up. And as Ed Viesturs says in his book, both of those leaders, Hall and Fischer, said, "What are you guys doing?" And Viesturs said, "We're going down." Quote, "It just doesn't feel right." Of course, that surprised them each, and Viesturs even said that made them question whether maybe they were making the right decision. This is Scott Fischer and Rob Hall. They're going up, and here I am, Ed Viesturs, with David Brashears and Robert Schauer, some of the great mountaineers of our time. They're heading down. So you can understand there's a lot of pressure and second guessing going on the mountain. But as Ed said, again, he had seen summit fever before. If 8 climbers head up, they pull 10 more with them, and the mood is, so-and-so's going today, well, we should be going too. That's summit fever. It's a horrible place to be. I've seen it happen, and it's taken a lot of lives, and May 10th and May 11th was no exception. As Rob Hall's and Scott Fischer's teams made it into Camp 4, to be in position to go to the summit on May 9th, the winds were horrendous. As I've said in a previous video where I'll put the link in the description, the conditions were so bad that the Sherpa team who went in advance of that, and Anatoly Boukreev from the Mountain Madness team, they couldn't even set the tents up. The wind was howling, and so at one point they got the client from Mountain Madness, Clev Schoening, to climb into the tent to hold it down while they set it up. Not a good forecast for going to the summit that night, because the plan on May 9th was to leave at about midnight in order to summit on the morning of May 10th. So fast forward to about 11:30 on May 9th into the early morning hours of May 10th. Rob Hall's team departs Camp 4 first, about a half hour ahead of Scott Fischer's team. As the teams made their way on up toward the triangular face, the ultimate plan made between Scott Fischer and Rob Hall was that their lead climbing Sherpas were going to fix ropes ahead of the climbers that were following them, and in order to do that, it required Ang Dorje Sherpa from Adventure Consultants and Lopsang Sherpa from Scott Fischer's Mountain Madness to go up with a couple hundred feet of rope to fix it up above the balcony toward the Hillary Step and over the Hillary Step. Now, the idea of fixing ropes, while nowadays we talk about it all the time, it's pretty obvious that the rope is going to give somebody a lot of security should he or she slip, or also just a guide so they know where to go. So the fixed ropes were an absolutely crucial element to this. And what a climber will do is they will carry a device that essentially grips onto the rope and slides upwards, but when you pull back, it grips. They're the little teeth on a cam device that sticks to the rope, and they slide that upwards, and then they can essentially more or less pull themselves up the rope. And the idea also of fixing the ropes well ahead of the clients who are coming is so they won't have to wait for those ropes to be fixed. Every minute adds up, and when somebody has to stop, not only are they beginning to get cold, but they're running down on their levels of oxygen. Most of the climbers now, one case in point is Scott Fischer's team had 2 bottles of oxygen that would have totaled about 12 hours of flowing oxygen at a moderate rate, not at a really high rate, wherein after they summited, they were meant to come back down the mountain and get a 3rd oxygen bottle at the south summit. And this still leaves very little room for error because that other bottle represented about 6 hours of oxygen at a moderate flow rate of about 2 to 2.5 liters a minute. That's 18 hours round trip from Camp 4 all the way to the summit, all the way back down to Camp 4 again. 18 hours. That's like there's not a lot of room for error there. And then after those 18 hours are up, then they're in that position of having to get even farther down the mountain where the air is ostensibly thicker and they're going to be able to function better. But what happens at altitude in the death zone is the brain starts to operate a little slower, decision making is more difficult, sometimes even speech becomes an issue up there. The temperatures are cold, you lose a sense of your appetite, you don't even want to drink water up there. So that idea of it being the death zone is literal. People are literally dying up there. There's a very short window of opportunity for a climber to get in and get out. So again, Lopsang and Ong Dorje, it was their job to collaborate and begin fixing these ropes. Now this is an area of controversy. This isn't a criticism of Lopsang necessarily or of Ong Dorje necessarily. Perhaps there were some mix-ups there, but history says that it was ultimately their job to do it. If they had made other arrangements, it's not known to me. And even Neal Beidleman, who was one of the guides for Scott Fischer's Mountain Madness team, gets up to the balcony and he sees Lopsang there, and he says that he had witnessed Lopsang short roping Sandy Pittman up the triangular face and other times during that morning. And so first of all, what is a short rope? A short rope is you have a rope fixed tightly around your waist, clipped into your harness, and then you might have 6 feet of rope trailing behind you, and you would clip that into the harness of the other person that you're with. And when that's clipped in, as you're heading up, you could literally pull the rope and give physical assistance to that person. Short ropes are used very frequently on rescues, wherein the person being rescued can still be ambulatory on his or her own feet. And sometimes what a rescuer will do is they'll allow that person to go down first, and the rope will be in their arms, and if that person slips, they can tug the rope back and hold them up. Now, one of the other things that Beidleman said he saw is that Lopsang was climbing without oxygen, and Scott Fischer's position was that all the Western guides should absolutely be using oxygen, but he left it up to the Sherpa to choose for themselves whether they were going to be using oxygen. As Scott Fischer said, these are his words, they are a different breed. But the Sherpa do perform much better at higher altitudes. One, because they live at a higher altitude, and physiologically they're in a better position to be prepared. But once we get to altitude, everyone is human. Up to 8,000 meters or above, every human being gets cold, and they do not function at maximum levels without bottled oxygen. And another thing that Beidleman said was Lopsang was, quote, incapable of doing what he was supposed to be doing. He said that he was really, really tired and enervated after the work that he had been doing with Sandy Pittman. And so Beidleman went forward and fixed hundreds of feet of rope, which took a lot of time. Now, it was still early in the day. There was still no signs of a storm moving in. So it seemed okay. Like, this was not going to be a gigantic problem, but the progress did slowed it down for at least an hour, maybe more, and climbers were beginning to collect at the balcony, waiting for the ropes to be fixed, so they themselves are using precious oxygen, and they are getting colder, and time is, if you will, running down. Beidleman finally gets up to the south summit, expecting Lopsang to show up and help, and as Beidleman said, he never did, and Anatoly did show up, and they decided to fix more lines up through the Cornice Ridge and above the Hillary Step. And now here's the thing that not a lot of people discuss. Beidleman said that Anatoly was not climbing with oxygen. Everybody knows that. However, Beidleman maintains that he was told that he was to be using oxygen. That was what Scott Fischer said. This is out of the words of Neal Beidleman. I'm not making anything up here. And so as Beidleman inquired about it, why aren't you on oxygen? And here they were above the balcony and to the south summit. Beidleman says that Boukreev looked at me and said, no need oxygen, and he gave Boukreev gave Beidleman his oxygen bottle and regulator. Now, Neal is already carrying all this other things, and he said he didn't need the extra weight, about 7 pounds, but oxygen is solid gold up there, and so, well, liquid gold or a gaseous gold up there. And so he took the oxygen bottle and left the regulator behind him. And he speculated that the idea of going without oxygen was something potentially culturally burned into him a little bit, not necessarily an ego thing, but this is how we do it in Kazakhstan and in my Soviet comrades. We climb in pure alpine style. However, there were a lot of clients who could have used every ounce of energy. Upward, Boukreev went, and he reached the summit first of all the other climbers at about 1 o'clock or shortly thereafter. And many of the clients had not reached the summit by 2 o'clock, which was a designated turnaround time, especially mandated very vocally by Rob Hall himself, who said, if you're not on the summit by 2 o'clock, you have to turn around, or within a reasonable distance of the summit, it's time to turn around. Now, what happened was Boukreev remained on the summit. Beidleman was up there. Jon Krakauer reached the summit as well. Now, I'm not going to go into the minutia of who summited at what time, and suffice it to say that the 2 o'clock hour came and went, and most of the people had not yet reached the summit, clients and guides. And it was about that time that the storm began to form. Now, it was a big surprise to everyone. Even the experienced Brashears and Viesturs of the IMAX team thought that, well, we have a fairly good day happening, but the storm was on its way. But still, most people were completely, I should say everybody was completely unaware that the storm was barreling in toward them. But the fact that they continued moving upward was a problem. So another thing that Beidleman says about Anatoly Boukreev is that even though he was climbing faster than him without the oxygen, he had other responsibilities as a guide. And I know a lot of people watch these videos and become enraged that anybody would question the motives of Anatoly Boukreev. And I guess I understand it, but when you're a guide, you have a responsibility that is not really only for yourself. It's not about pure style or alpine style. It's about the clients. And I have an interview with Adrian Ballinger, one of the greatest mountaineers of our era and one of the great guides of our era. And he's just absolutely shocked that any guide would consider climbing Mount Everest without the use of bottled oxygen. And as a pilot, Adrian talks about how a pilot needs to put oxygen on at 12,000 feet to function perfectly in order to fly an airplane at maximum levels. Now we're talking, here's Anatoly on the summit of Mount Everest, 29,035 feet or 8,850 meters without O's, and he can't linger there. He might be superhuman, the greatest climber who's ever lived in the history of humankind. But no matter what, without oxygen up there, you're going to start getting cold. So Anatoly decided to head back down to Camp 4 to, if you will, rest up and prepare tea for the clients as they came back into camp. Now, people are going to be like, how could you criticize Anatoly? If the storm hadn't arrived, it might have been the perfect plan. But it did arrive, and so it wasn't the perfect plan. You have to encompass all possibilities and be close to your clients at all times in order to ensure their safety. The lack of oxygen changes your mental acuity, and without O2, you get very cold very fast. So Boukreev was left with no decision but to descend down to Camp 4, and Beidleman, who was very good friends, very, very close friends with Anatoly, says he believes that he made the wrong choice to go without O's. They had climbed Manaslu together, that they were the only people on the mountain. I believe Beidleman was the 7th American to climb Manaslu, and Boukreev was the first Kazakh to climb the mountain. They were really, really close. So Beidleman is, and he's got to be one of the nicest guys in the world too. He just said climbing without O's was not a good call. That's it for part 1. Hopefully that trigger didn't set too many of you off. I hope you'll leave your thoughts and impressions in the comments below. It's always very interesting to see the conversation that we can get going there. Keep it respectful, and in the meantime, I will put the link to part 2 in the description below when it is posted. It will be coming out a week from the day that this video is posted. So thanks very much. Remember, do somebody a good deed. Don't ask for anything in return. Make the world a better place, one tiny step at a time. Peace be with you, my friends.